Somewhere in the world right now, someone is dying. In a hospital bed, in a hospice, in a home surrounded by people who love them. And within hours, a machine will start moving. Paperwork, phone calls, a funeral home. A process so automatic you've probably never had to think about how it actually works. But strip away the machine, strip away the phone calls and the paperwork in the funeral homes, and you're left with the oldest problem our species has ever had to solve. What do you do with a body that used to be a person you loved? For most of human history, there was no machine to answer that question. Just you, the corpse, and whatever your community decided death actually meant. And the answer our ancestors came up with is stranger, older, and more emotionally complicated than almost anyone realizes. Let's start with the story that made headlines for 50 years. In the 1950s, an archaeologist named Ralph Solke was excavating a cave in Iraqi Kurdistan called Shanidar. He found the remains of Neanderthals, and around one skeleton in particular, something remarkable turned up in the soil. Clumps of pollen. Not scattered pollen you'd expect from wind or animals wandering through, but dense clusters, as if entire flowering plants had been laid into the grave. Solke became convinced he'd found proof that Neanderthals mourned their dead with flowers, the same way we might lay a wreath on a coffin today. He wrote that someone in the last ice age must have wandered the mountainside gathering blooms for someone they'd lost. The find was so moving it reshaped how the entire world saw Neanderthals, not brutish, not subhuman, capable of grief, capable of love. For decades, that story stood. Then in 2023, a team of researchers went back to the pollen data with modern tools, and what they found complicates everything. The pollen clumps weren't a mix of flowers that would have bloomed at the same time. They looked instead exactly like something bees leave behind. Solitary bees are known to nest in cave floors, and their burrows, still visible in less trafficked parts of Shanidar today, produce almost identical pollen clusters. The lead researcher on that study said he now favors a much less romantic explanation, that Neanderthals may have laid branches and vegetation over the body, not flowers, and possibly just to protect it, not to honor it. 50 years of the first flower people, quietly complicated by bee burrows. But here's what almost nobody reports about that story. Even the researchers who question the flowers don't question the burial itself. New excavations at Shanidar between 2018 and 2022 uncovered another Neanderthal skeleton, dated to roughly 73,000 years ago, deliberately placed in a dugout depression, part of a tight cluster of bodies gathered around the same spot in the cave, over and over, generation after generation. One archaeologist on the project put it simply, you might bury a body just to keep scavengers away, but when a group keeps returning to the exact same location to bury their dead for thousands of years, that's not practical anymore. That's memory, that's meaning. And the timeline goes back even further than Shanidar. The earliest undisputed intentional burials by our own species, Homo sapiens, date to roughly 120,000 years ago, according to anthropologist Mary Steiner. 120,000 years before writing, before agriculture, before anything we'd recognize as civilization, and our ancestors were already digging graves on purpose. So why bury a body at all? The boring answer is disease control. A decomposing corpse attracts scavengers, spreads pathogens, and smells terrible in a small camp. Early burial likely started as pure practicality, but somewhere along the way, practicality turned into something else entirely, and nowhere is that shift more obvious than at a site in Russia called Sungir. Around 30,000 years ago, in the middle of an ice age, someone in Sungir spent an almost unimaginable number of hours preparing 3 bodies for burial. An adult man was laid to rest wearing roughly 3,000 mammoth ivory beads sewn into his clothing, his body dusted in red ochre. Nearby, 2 children, one around 10 years old, the other around 13, were buried head to head, drowned in even more elaborate decoration than the adult beside them. Across the whole site, archaeologists eventually counted more than 13,000 ivory beads. Each one had to be carved and drilled by hand from mammoth tusk. Researchers estimate the beadwork alone represents something like 10,000 hours of labor, 10,000 hours spent by an Ice Age community dressing the dead. Think about what that means. These weren't wealthy people in any modern sense. They were Ice Age hunter-gatherers, surviving brutal winters on mammoth meat and whatever they could carry, and yet they were willing to pour thousands of hours of collective labor into decorating 2 children. And who, by definition, hadn't lived long enough to earn status through hunting, leadership, or skill. Some archaeologists think this means status in Sungir wasn't something you achieved. It was something you were born into, which would make this one of the earliest hints we have of inherited social rank, hiding inside a funeral. Other researchers go further and suggest something darker. The unusual position of the 2 children, the sheer scale of their burial compared to any other grave at the site, has led some to wonder whether they were sacrificed rather than simply mourned. It's not settled. it may never be, but it means one of the most beautiful burials ever found from the Ice Age might also be one of the most disturbing. And it's not just Europe. In a rock shelter in Malawi, archaeologists recently identified the oldest known intentional cremation in Africa, dated to around 9,500 years ago. That discovery alone rewrote assumptions about what small hunter-gatherer bands were capable of. Cremation takes fuel, sustained heat, and coordinated effort. It was assumed to belong to larger, more complex societies. Instead, it belonged to foragers, thousands of years before agriculture existed in that region. And in southern China, at a site called Kaiatu, archaeologists studying 9,000-year-old pottery found something even stranger: residue of beer. Not beer brewed for everyday drinking, but beer brewed specifically as part of funeral ritual, which means somewhere on the other side of the planet, in a completely unconnected culture, mourners were doing something eerily familiar: gathering, drinking together. Marking the loss of someone with a shared meal, the same basic instinct behind every wake, every funeral reception, every gathering after a loss that humans still hold today. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Grief itself, the raw experience of loss, appears to be close to universal across every human culture ever studied. But how people are allowed to express that grief is not universal at all. In some cultures, historically, mourners physically marked their bodies, even severing finger joints to visibly display the depth of their loss. In other places, anthropologists have documented communities where grieving parents show almost no outward emotion after losing a child, not because they don't feel it, but because a lifetime of high infant mortality forced them to armor themselves against a pain they knew was coming. Grief isn't the variable. How safe you're allowed to feel it out loud is. Which brings us back to that beginning, to the phone calls, the paperwork, the funeral home. It's easy to think of that process as clinical, modern, disconnected from anything our ancestors would recognize. But it's not disconnected at all. It's the same instinct that carved 13,000 beads by hand in an Ice Age winter. The same instinct that laid branches over a Neanderthal body 70,000 years before anyone wrote a word down. The same instinct that brewed beer for a funeral 9,000 years ago on the other side of the world from Sungir, with no possible contact between the two. For over 100,000 years in caves, on frozen plains, in rock shelters and river valleys, humans have been doing the same fundamental thing, refusing to let death be the end of the story without a ritual to mark it. The rituals change. The beads become flowers, become caskets, become urns, become whatever comes next. But the impulse underneath it, the refusal to simply let a body disappear without meaning, that hasn't changed in over 1,000 centuries, and it probably never will.